Aid technically is called Official Development Assistance. In Europe they call it ODA. In the US we like to say ODA. And what it really is financing from governments, either directly through their bilateral aid agencies or indirectly through multilateral agencies like the World Bank, that's focused on poverty and improving the lives of poor people. What makes aid really special, because there are lots of types of financing out there, is that aid is really uniquely focused on improving the lives of the poor. One of the challenges here is the definition of aid itself. So this definition, the whole concept of aid has been around for, 30, 40 years. And it was meant to capture how wealthy countries are making a difference in the lives of poor people in poor countries. It was really meant, though, to capture their contributions. So it tells us a lot more about what a country like Germany or the United States is doing for Tanzania than what is actually happening on the ground in Tanzania and what the impact of that work is. So there's a whole literature that's come up around impact and how we find out the real value of what we've invested in that's different from just tracking who's putting in what. So that's one of the challenges of aid. It's been hard to explain what it does well. We find it easier to say when aid projects have worked at a project level, say a particular project to vaccinate children or a particular project to increase the yields of farmers in Ghana for cocoa. Those are easier things to measure. What aid has done as a whole to save lives or increase growth is much harder to say because it is so diverse and because it is so hard to capture at scale what the specific impact of the aid has been alongside all of the other factors that have contributed to those changes in lives saved, in economic growth achieved, etc. Aid has done many, many things. But one of the challenges here is how many small successes there have been in aid. All of the wells drilled, all the schools set up, all of the teachers trained, all of the organizations that are out there trying to understand what their governments are doing and hold them to account for doing a better job. Really endless numbers of projects that have really changed and improved people's lives. At a high level, aid has played an important part in helping to reduce the cost of key investments that are changing the lives of poor people. There's a book out there called Getting Better by Charles Kenny, which talks about how a poor person today has a much better chance of seeing their children survive past the first or fifth year of their lives, thanks not to their increased income, but because the cost and the availability of the drugs they need to help those kids has gone down. So the cost has come down so much and they're much more available. Aid has played a big part in that, both on the research and development side, through funding the development of vaccines and technologies that wouldn't have existed without aid, but also on the other side, making sure that they get delivered and paid for. There's pressure on donor countries to spend less on aid because their budgets are tight. There's also pressure on them to spend differently. So if you have a tight budget and you want to spend money on aid, countries may want to spend it in a way that supports their own private businesses that are working in the developing world. And that could be a real shame if it leads aid to be invested in ways that are less useful for poor people who are really the proper beneficiaries of those investments. It's also true that there's a feeling that other resources are going to solve these problems. People talk more and more about globalization and the private sector reaching more and more people in the developing world. And some people may use that as an excuse to say that aid is less relevant or doesn't matter. But the truth is, it really does. And to the extent that aid is a complement to those other resource flows, it's even more important that we think harder about how we allocate aid well. It shouldn't be replaced by these other investment flows. I think if you want to look at how well aid is being used, you ought to look at it next to other resources and compare apples to apples. How well are private sector investments made? How often do they fail? How do we judge failure and success in the private sector? It's ultimately by how much profit you make, by whether those were good decisions or not, as a portfolio, not as an individual choice. Same thing goes for aid. On the whole, over the last 40 years, aid has made a huge difference in the lives of poor people around the world.